Hello again. Well, this is part 2 of the protest for Apple. I'm in Santa Cruz now. My phone died in Cupertino and I had to drive all the way back to Santa Cruz. Ran a few errands and here I am again. So if you're actually watching part 2, thank you. Congratulations. You put up with 44 minutes of me in part 1. And if you hadn't, I would recommend going back and looking at that video. Just to recap real quickly, so Apple has what we call this dichotomous business model. And it's dichotomous in that it has two parts that conflict with one another. The first part is the Q2Q growth that it has to maintain. And the second part is the social justice and the activism for social causes. And under Steve Jobs, those were accomplished without, I'm going to sit down here on this nice bench here. Kind of nice place. So under Steve Jobs, the dichotomous business model didn't run into any conflicts. Jobs innovated, and through those innovations, he was able to keep that demand pipeline going and also price products at a premium. Under Tim Cook, starting in 2011, the innovation basically started to dry up and new products were scarce in terms of breakthrough products. And Apple knew that it would have a lot of derivative products coming out that would be chipped away in terms of the price premium that they could command. So they needed to find a place to maintain their Q2Q growth due to their lack of innovation, and that turned out to be China. And China provided a population of 1.4 billion consumers and also a manufacturing and operational setup with Foxconn that had very low costs, so at the time. So they were able to cut their cost and grow the scope of their marketplace by entering China. The problem is that in doing so, Apple had to sacrifice some of its moral principles. And those moral principles I went over in part 1 that impacted things like human rights and human dignity and helping each other. And Apple did not, Apple sort of became beholden to China in that way. So I'm going to continue on here. I want to talk quickly about cancel culture. So we know Apple is a progressive company. They put a lot of money into the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren campaigns this year. And if we look at what Jobs was, and under Jobs, Jobs was a centrist liberal. He believed in traditional liberal values like anti-war, environmentalism, and freedom of speech. So he believed that everybody has the right to debate and be heard. But progressives don't do that. What progressives do is they don't want to hear an alternative viewpoint. And right now they have the power basically to cancel. These are the woke progressives, they call them. Woke Democrats. And we see it all over the place. Things like Gone with the Wind being censored and Aunt Jemima syrup being torn off the shelf, and people losing their jobs because of something they did 10 years ago at a Halloween costume party. That's cancel culture, and it's real and it's alive. So does Apple practice anything related to cancel culture? And I posit yes, they do. And I go back to following the money. So in the 2020 campaign, I mentioned $400,000 was given to Bernie Sanders, $200,000 to Elizabeth Warren, and 59,000 was given to a candidate named Andrew Yang. And Andrew Yang is a Democrat. And all of these Democrats debated. They went up to the podiums on television and they all debated. And what made Andrew Yang unique was that he was the only one to come out and say that he did not accept the counterculture. He publicly denounced it in front of everyone, publicly. And that's what made Andrew Yang unique in that particular area. But meanwhile, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have never denounced cancel culture. And these are the candidates that are pushed and supported by Apple. So in my report, I give numerous examples, case studies, if you will, of Apple canceling conservatives. And a good example of that, just one example, is when a group of LGBTQ members of a small community, online community, wrote a petition to Apple stating that a religious application went against the LGBTQ community. Well, Apple, instead of, going and trying to strike a fair balance, they went in and basically removed the app. So this Christian organization was deplatformed by Apple, and that's called canceling. So cancel culture is alive and well, and Apple participates in it. Okay, so the problem for Apple is that the cancel culture and this progressive platform and the activism has bled into the Apple products. These aren't independent, unbiased products anymore. Just like Twitter. Everyone knows that Twitter is very highly slanted toward liberal, progressive ideals. So, the difference between Twitter and Apple, though, is that I can go to another app, maybe Parler, which is just like Twitter, which is a free speech platform, and I can get exactly and more value from Parler than I can with Twitter, because I'm going to be silenced on Twitter. And I'm sorry, the comparison was actually Parler and Facebook, but you get the idea. So there are all competing applications as long as Apple allows them to go onto their platform, and sometimes they don't. And that's what makes Apple so powerful, that they don't, they can decide who goes onto the platform. And so notice that you can always, on the iOS, on the iPhone, you can find the Twitter app, the Facebook app, other apps, which means that Apple condones what these apps are doing. It accepts that these apps, like Twitter, are censoring conservatives because it helps Apple's cause, its own social activism. And that's really why Apple is just so powerful. So I just wanted to read this next section a little in more detail, but who's protecting Apple? So who in government protects Apple? So that entity, as we all know, based on what Apple, where their money goes, is the Democrat Party. In both 2016 and 2020, Apple contributions to the Trump campaign through its affiliates was a giant zero. So we know that Apple puts all of its money into the Democratic campaigns, and now almost all of that it goes toward progressive campaigns. So what is this symbiotic relationship? What does Apple gain from going with the Democrats, who share the same values as Apple, the progressive values? So what does Apple gain in this relationship, and what do the Democrats gain? So in terms of what the Democrats gain, Apple will act as an activist that supports progressive causes that are dear to the Democrats. They also contribute to Democratic campaigns and its causes. And they manage the internet traffic as well as their own apps that advance the progressive narratives, while at the same time censoring anti-progressive thought. And let me mention that they also want to keep the Democrats in power. Why? Here's why. Because the Democrats ensure that anti-China propaganda is contained through the mainstream media. You don't hear about China as the bad guy. You hear it from Trump, but you don't hear it from the Democrats. They've always been light on China. Why? Because they work with the big American, big tech companies who have operations in China, who do not want a hornet's nest to be disturbed. In addition, Democrats will block legislation unfavorable to China when they have to. So this is a nice symbiotic relationship, and why corporations, big tech corporations, work with the Democrats, because they both benefit from that relationship. The Democrats keep China quiet, and Apple uses its big tech platforms to promote progressive causes and to limit speech of conservatives. Why do the Democrats ever get pissed off at any of the social media companies? Not because they're getting censored, because they want more censorship of conservatives. One last thing before I go to the, almost done, to the next to last section. But I don't know if anyone watched the Democratic National Convention. Just ended a couple of days ago. Does anyone remember the word China ever being brought into the conversation? Even when Cuomo, the governor of New York, spoke, he didn't speak of the China virus. He called it the European virus. That's odd. The European virus. So, when you don't hear things on the mainstream media or by the Democrats, when you don't hear about Hong Kong, when you don't hear about concentration camps in China, with Muslim minority populations being sterilized, body organs being removed and sold, and who knows what happens after that. That's because these corporations want that, because they don't want our government to sanction China and to get China angry, because that will create problems for Apple. Apple is so reliant on China. It hasn't diversified its manufacturing all that much that it needs China to be happy, and it needs the U.S. to comply and be passive when China disturbs the world. Okay, so I wanted to talk quickly about globalism and the rise of authoritarianism. So back to the duopoly of Apple and Google And by the way, those guys are 15-minute car drive apart from one another in Silicon Valley. 15 minutes. A stone's throw. Two companies that hold 100% of all the smartphone OSs in the world. That is just frightening. Okay, so big tech, why is it such a prize to the politicians? Because it's a veritable gold mine of central control and potential voter manipulation. And the big tech are politically biased, activist in nature, and duopolistic. Two of them controlling everything. That's money in the bank if you're a politician. So you can reach, with these two companies, you can send universal messages across the world, different countries, even internally to one country. A single ideology, a single message. Maybe you promote Green New Deal, or climate change, or socialism in a very biased way by what apps you allow to go onto your phone and what those apps can do in terms of speech. But it gets a little more worrisome. And that is the apps and Apple and Google collect a lot of private data on you. And when, say, you go to Amazon, you go to Amazon and you buy things. Amazon figures out eventually what you like to buy. Well, if you're a person who reads news, maybe a certain type of news, they know where you go, they know what events you go to, they know what type of news you read, they know what your comments are about news stories, they know what political leaning you are, they categorize you, and they have a lot of information about your wants and your needs and your emotions, and they use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and algorithm modeling to profile you. Why couldn't these profiles be used to manipulate the way you vote? That's not far-fetched at all. These algorithms are very sophisticated, and with AI, they just keep learning and learning all about you. They even know where you're sitting right now. They know exactly where I'm sitting right now, and wondering why I'm here trying to hurt Apple. I'm not trying to hurt Apple. I'm trying to warn Apple that we're coming, because we know how bad you are. So the recommendations at the end of my report, I have various, but just quickly, companies like Apple can no longer be allowed to be protected under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Apple is biased, and to have control of the OS in addition to the applications that it uses to promote its own cultural values and to deny counter viewpoints when it feels threatened, it can do that. So my recommendations are that Apple and Google need to be broken up by antitrust. And the only way, of course, this is going to happen if there's a Republican landslide and Republicans win back Congress. And if they do, you better run, because voices like mine are becoming more prevalent because you decided to step on us. So that's one idea. And I have another idea. The iPhone OS should be up for grabs. Third parties should be able to develop OS, their own OS, whether it's Linux or anything else, onto the iPhone. Apple does not deserve to control the OS on every single iPhone, because the temptation of its activism is what causes it to get into trouble and to break laws and to work with governments to step on human beings, which it does, and it's demonstrated it repeatedly. As long as what it does, it advances its dichotomous business model, then it'll do it. And it creeps into their products until Americans will find the same thing here. And we're already finding it. So, remove Section 230 protections, break up Apple, break up Google, and allow third-party OS developers to install their own OS onto the iPhone. Would you like that, Apple? I don't think so. So I'm going to close my report with a metaphor. And it is, well, it goes back to 1984, that wonderful George Orwell novel about Big Brother. And that novel is basically about a single authoritarian government that controlled what people heard and saw and said, where people became almost mute and they had to follow whatever Big Brother said to them to do. Well, in the actual year 1984, Apple came out with a iconic commercial, a Super Bowl commercial, that has a crowd of gray figures staring motionlessly at a large television screen up on the ceiling or up on the high part of the wall in a giant auditorium. Everything's dark and gray. They're marching to a single beat, and the leader's voice is on that television screen, droning on. That single message droning on. Until a woman is seen running through the hallway, and she's in color, and she's carrying a giant sledgehammer. And as that woman enters the hall, she launches that sledgehammer into the screen where the leader is speaking and breaks that screen and unchains those people, unchains their mind by having broken that thought of the leader. That commercial was one of the best commercials ever made. It was in the Steve Jobs era, and it was to announce the Mac. When everyone else had an IBM PC, everyone worked on the PC. It was all the same. It was ordinary. There's nothing unique about it. We all sat on it. It was a PC. It was a Windows PC. The Mac was to change things. The Mac was to break that mindset that people were in and locked onto and ordered to follow. Well, today, in 2020, that leader on the television screen is Apple and Tim Cook. They are denying speech. They are protecting an authoritarian government. they ignore human rights violations, which they're often the cause of. Their brand is tarnished. But no one's going to talk about it except maybe me. But the company's dangerous. And it's becoming the big brother, along with the Democrats who control them and protect China, and want you to think a certain way. And if you don't, you get canceled. And that's what 1984 is all about. So I hope you take that thought, think about it, and act upon it if you're a conservative. So I wanted to wrap up here with one thing. Tim Cook, when George Floyd died, he went on to his website, and under apple.com/racism, he wrote a long article, a personal letter to the employees of Apple, talking about racism and privilege and all of the woke terms, and supporting the movement of Black Lives Matter. The problem, as I said, Apple does things selectively. They believe in selective human rights, and we've seen that in China. If it helps their dichotomous business model, they'll do whatever it takes to make sure that they continue to survive and grow into their mammoth company. But I want to take you here and let you see this. Sorry about that. And I'm wondering, does anyone know who that little boy on the right is? Do you, Tim Cook? This little boy, about a week ago, was executed with a gunshot at close range to the back of his head when he was riding his bicycle. He was shot by this man, who's about 26 years old. Did you see this much? Were there riots? Was there a Black Lives Matter statement about this little boy? Did Tim Cook write a letter to his employees about this little boy? His name is Cannon Hinnant. He was executed, 5 years old. So, in showing that to you, some people might call me a racist. Certainly the progressive community would. Maybe even Tim Cook would. Because I'm showing a black man killing a white child. But why wasn't there the same outpour of anger and violence and hatred that came from the movement of Black Lives Matter when George Floyd died? What happened to this little boy? What happened to the anger for the community of why this happened? Where is Tim Cook in all of this? Well, that little boy doesn't fit the narrative, the progressive narrative. It doesn't fit Black Lives Matter. He's not selected by Tim Cook for human rights protection. So I'll read you this last passage that I wrote. And by the way, if you think I'm a racist, go ahead. But I spent 2 years with the Peace Corps as a teacher, teaching black Africans in Guinea, West Africa. I made $4 a day for 2 years. I got dysentery. I was sick a lot. And those were some of the nicest people I ever met. It's not about skin color. It's about character. It's about who you are and not the melanin in your skin. And that's something that Steve Jobs would have agreed with. And he wanted to live in a colorblind society, and that was what the 60s liberal wanted. And that's all disappeared now. And you guys, the progressives, are on the wrong side of history, and you've set civil rights movements back for decades. So let me finish reading this, and I'll let you guys go to dinner. I know you're hungry. I close with this question to you, Mr. Cook. Why have I not seen a full page on your website speaking of the murder execution of 5-year-old Cannon Hinnant? In the same way that you support and endorse Black Lives Matter and label all white people as privileged. Why? Because you and your employees have a double standard. When you talk about human dignity, human rights, and social justice, there is no golden casket for Cannon. Is there, Mr. Cook? Apple didn't spend one dime of its $2 trillion market cap to buy him one. Apple is now exposed as a fraud that every American should know about. Your social justice is selective. You are repugnant human rights abusers. When Apple is the beneficiary. The Apple brand is a, pardon my French, crock of shit. A brand that was carefully crafted over decades by Steve Jobs. And Tim Cook has ruined that brand. You don't hear it because you don't study it. You need to look at Apple more closely than you have. So Apple's days are numbered, and you better pray to God that Republicans do not take both houses, or both Apple and Google, the dangerous duopoly that the world should fear, will scatter into pieces once American patriots get through with you. And to the Apple shareholders, can't leave you out, all the shareholders who made lots of money off of Donald Trump policies, this is for you. Your imminent downfall is entirely your own fault for supporting Tim Cook's activism, which bled onto Apple products to the detriment of conservative speech and free speech. Instead of focusing on innovation, like Steve Jobs, you allowed Tim Cook to spend his valuable time colluding with Democrats and with China to make life worse for anyone who happened to stand in Apple's way. If Steve Jobs was alive today, I'm sure he would have regretted the decision to place Tim Cook at the helm of Apple. Apple is a reckless giant that only the people can take down before it is too late to do so. And we will. And that's the end of my protest. Thank you very much.